Grüß, willkommen in einem Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 23 of my organisational series. In this video, I'll attempt to provide an overview of the comparative strengths of the various PRC or PLA and ROCA formations. This video is a complement of my ROC and PRC Armed Forces videos, and is designed to allow us to look at the component formations and attempt to determine some form of combat strength for those formations and compare them against each other. This will allow us to predict any conflicts or the results of any conflicts between these particular formations. In my previous videos, I outlined my personal belief, and it is only my personal belief, that if the US becomes involved in any conflict, the PRC will be unable to land sufficient military forces on Taiwan in order to guarantee victory, and will almost certainly suffer some form of humiliating defeat, which is something they would never risk. I must point out this will not always be the case. The strength of the forces the PRC could land have increased at least 50% since 2014. If it increases an additional 50% in the following 8 to 10 years, then this prediction that I've made may no longer be the case, unless, of course, the ROCA beefs up its military, or if the US deploys troops on Taiwan. The latter I seriously doubt will occur. In my previous videos, my assumptions when I looked at the various combat or strategies were that the opposing brigades were approximately of similar strength. However, this was initially a pure gut feel guess. Let's try and determine if my gut feel guess is correct or is totally wrong, and thus my predictions of the result of any initial battles is completely correct or incorrect. The method I'm using to determine strength is to use a figure gaming points-based system to give each formation a points value or total. I'm using the old Call Commander point system, which is very detailed and goes right down to visualization systems in each vehicle. This point system could be completely wrong, but at least it gives me an idea of a possible technical strength of the various formations. Aspects such as training morale is not included in this analysis. That's simply too hard to determine, although I'll provide some opinions. In terms of training, my personal gut feel is that any initial PLA forces will have a high degree of training and be of high morale. If the morale is based on propaganda which does not reflect reality, I suspect the morale will quickly collapse, but for the critical first weeks it should hold. On the other side, the ROC morale will be high, and as they are defending their homeland against an invader, I suspect the level of morale may reach a very high level indeed, which could even apply to the reservists. If Taipei falls, this may no longer be the case, but once again I suspect morale will be very high on the ROC side. As for training, the PLA forces should have a high degree of training, specifically the amphibious brigades. Reinforcements and replacements may not, but once again for the first critical few weeks I have to assume the level of training will be very high on the PLA side. On the ROC side, the regular army will have a very high level of training, but the reservists will obviously have less. As long as the reservists are mainly focused on defence, this should not be a major issue, but this does limit the ability of the ROCA to launch local counter-attacks. The final point is doctrine, and I'm afraid this is a wild card. I have no idea if the PLA doctrine will be inferior or superior to the ROCA doctrine. I have to leave this up to the viewers to decide. I have no firm opinion on the points, but at the end of the video I'll provide some of the differences between the doctrine and where there could be advantages and disadvantages on both sides based on these differences. Let's now drill down into the point system. This shows an example of the point system, in this case the Type 86 US Armoured Division, which happened to have been deployed in Europe in about 1989. The regiment or equivalent level of command is now identified or pointed to. The number of each regiment is also indicated, as is its combat strength. The next level of formation and the final level of formation is the battalion or equivalent. The number of each battalion is indicated. In this case there are 2 tank battalions. Moving to the right we come to a battalion combat strength, in this case 2,201, followed by a battalion code and finally a combat value using a set of rules based on the SPI Modern Battles board game. We'll be looking at that in more detail later. The value will generally be ignored for the video up until the end part, as it's used for a set of figure gaming rules, but the other values may prove to be useful in order to give us an idea of the various combat strengths of the formations. In front of the battalion name is a mobility symbol, which could be motorised, horse, cycle, armoured and so on. In this case, it's APC, or Armoured Personnel Carrier. For some of the battalions, an idea of the weapons system within the formation is provided. In this case, this is a battalion which consists of 155mm howitzers. And now we come to the combat values or strengths in a little bit more detail. This is a points value of the formation using, I have to admit, a rather old set of figure gaming rules, in this case, Corps Commander. I could have used any set of rules, and while the results would vary a bit, I found they're all generally similar. So my gut feeling is these combat values do have some relevance. Of course, how close these values reflect real reality is another issue, which in this video I'm not going to be covering. Let's now start drilling into the formations, starting with the formation strengths of the ROCA, or Republic of China Army, or the Taiwanese forces. The current most powerful formation in the ROCA is the Mechanized Infantry Brigades. The points value here is 7,292 points, using existing standard equipment. If the ROCA used the M60 main battle tank, this would increase a bit, but it would not be really significant. If the ROCA used the M1 main battle tank, the impact would be significant and would increase the combat value of the brigade by a total of 1,250 points, which is no laughing matter. This is more significant than it may seem, as with the M1 main battle tank, this mechanised brigade would have a combat strength closer to the PRC heavy and medium brigades, which currently it does not. The brigade, in this case, consists of 3 infantry, 1 armoured battalion and 1 artillery battalion. Corps level assets would be attached, increasing the artillery and also anti-aircraft forces, but for simplicity, let's just specifically look at the brigade alone. Close behind the mechanised brigade is the armoured brigades, which consist of 1 infantry, 3 armoured and 1 artillery battalion. The impact of equipping this with M1 main battle tanks would even be more significant, increasing the combat strength by 1,600 points, making it more powerful than the mechanised brigades and a very significant counterattack force. These formations would have very significant attack strength, which would be critical if the ROCA wanted to push the PLA forces back into the sea. It becomes viable if the M1 main battle tank is equipping these formations. It probably is not viable today. The infantry brigades do not possess anywhere near as much combat strength, but in defence they would be reasonably effective. In prepared positions, their combat defensive strength would be increased by a factor of 2 or even 3, depending on the prepared positions. This formation would not be particularly effective in attack, although in an urban combat situation it would also be quite effective. The reserve brigades are similar to these formations, but with old equipment and less training. Looking at doctrine, one key point about these formations are the battalions consist of only a single troop type. The battalions would be expected to work closely together, and using this structure, there is an advantage and disadvantage in that. The advantage is flexibility. The brigade commander could tailor-make a task force to achieve a specific objective using whatever company-sized formations made sense from whichever battalion. This was something the Germans very effectively used in 1941 up to the end of the war. The disadvantage of this doctrine is the level of training required to make this work is significant. Prior to 1941, the Germans failed to use low-level combined arms attacks, and often their tanks found themselves unsupported. The Germans solved this in the Panzer divisions in 1941 and some of the Panzer Grenadier divisions in 1943 and 44, but it was not easy and it was not simple. Many times tanks and infantry, which were not used to working together, would find themselves not supporting each other effectively. This even occurred with the rebuilt Panzer divisions in September 1944 on the Western Front. If the ROCA has ensured all their troops are trained to work together, they would have achieved doctrinally the most effective brigade structure and operation possible. I have to assume this is the case. It's one of the things that the Taiwanese actually have a significant control over, and I would expect the morale and motivation of the troops would be high enough to ensure this would occur. Let's now move over to the other side, the PLA, which is the People's Liberation Army of the PRC, or People's Republic of China. The Heavy Combined Arms Brigade is a very powerful formation at 11,616 points. The main combat components are the 4 Heavy Combined Arms Battalions, which are very powerful all-arms formations. The support elements are reasonable as well, making this a formidable brigade indeed. The Amphibious Combined Arms Brigades require a bit of guesswork at my end, as I do not possess good TO&E info on this. If this formation is structured in the same manner as the Heavy Combined Arms Brigades, except all the equipment is amphibious, then, which is what I've assumed, it is also a very powerful brigade level formation. The amphibious equipment is not as effective as non-amphibious vehicles, so its strength is less, but it is nonetheless very powerful. I must point out this brigade may actually be a lot smaller, as the PRC lacks sufficient amphibious transport capacity to transport so much heavy weapons, so I'm not 100% certain if this is correct. The medium-sized Combined Arms Brigade is the closest to an armoured brigade in the PLA. Because this formation possesses a significant amount of main battle tanks, its combat strength, particularly in attack, is significant. I estimate this is the most powerful brigade in the PLA Army group and would be the main formation used in any main armoured style attacks. Once we move to the Light Combined Arms Brigade, the combat strength is significantly less, although still respectable. These formations would be easy to transport by sea and would possess good mobility over poor terrain, which makes them an important element in any invasion. They are basically motorised infantry brigades, although the vehicles they use are quite flexible and very effective in terms of cross-country motion. Let's now look at the doctrine, as this could have a significant impact in the actual effectiveness of these PLA formations. The Combined Armed Brigade concept is not new, being used by the Soviets when they first formed their tank brigades back in 1942. There is nothing new here, and what is really new in this particular case is that the combined arms element is brought down into the battalion, not just the regiment, with each battalion containing 2 tank and 2 infantry companies each. The actual tank companies in the combined arms battalions uses a similar structure as that of the Soviet motor rifle regiments, with the tank companies in the medium combined arms brigades organised in the same manner as the Soviet tank regiment. I suspect the company structure has its roots in this old Soviet-style structure which the PLA had adopted prior to the 1990s. However, the key point here is that the key difference of this formation is the mixing of tank and infantry companies within a single battalion. The US tried something along these lines in their old pentomic divisional structures, which some European NATO nations copied. I'm uncertain how successful this was, but the principle has some significant benefits. Getting battalion-sized formations to conduct themselves in a true combined arms manner is hard, mainly because different troop types rarely train together very much. It takes a significant amount of effort to ensure different troop types train together on a regular basis in a mixed troop type manner. Creating a battalion which has a mix of tank and infantry companies makes this a lot easier to ensure, as these troop types would train together by default and, as a result, you would assume, would effectively work together. There is a disadvantage, which is optimal flexibility. The ability to mix and match battalions and companies to achieve a specific objective gives a commander the greatest level of flexibility. This structure does not encourage that, and once the armour in a battalion has been degraded, that battalion formation becomes a pure infantry formation, and it's probably unlikely that this will be able to be mixed and matched with another battalion. The basic trade-off is a training versus effort versus optimization of your force mix. In any war, as any war will probably be decided in the first few weeks, this disadvantage may not be serious, but it does represent a significant difference between the PLA and ROCA. Final point that we need to consider is the PLA brigades will likely suffer casualties on the way in. If an amphibious vessel is hit with an SSM, it's likely the heavy equipment may be lost or unable to be unloaded, but the troops and their light equipment will get ashore. If this should occur, the combined arms nature of the battalion may be degraded to the point where this could only be useful for defence. Let's now go into a bit of a wargaming zone, and what I'm going to be attempting to do is to compare some of the formations using values from an SPI board game. I use a figure game conversion of the SPI Modern Battles board game on a regular basis, and these are the values I would use for my simulations of this type of military action. How closely this reflects in terms of reality is anyone's guess, but at least it gives us a starting point. This shows an ROCA mechanised brigade. It has a HQ battalion with support equipment, 3 mech infantry battalions, a tank battalion, and an artillery battalion. Let's now look at what these values mean. The first value, which is pointed to here, is the attack strength of that particular battalion, in this case 6. The next value is the defence strength, in this case for the main battle tank battalion 3, and for the self-propelled howitzer battalion 1. The last value is the movement allowance, in this case 12 for the main battle tank battalion and 9 for the self-propelled howitzer battalion. The indirect fire elements or units have special values, the first being a bombardment value or attack value which is achieved by using indirect fire. In this case, the value for the self-propelled howitzer battalion is 4. The next value is what's called FPF, or fire protection factor, or indirect defensive combat strength, which can be used in order to stop an enemy attack. In this case, the self-propelled howitzer battalion has an FPF value of 3. The last value is range, which depends on the ground scale for your game, and I'll not really delve too deeply into that during this video because this is not really a video covering any sets of specific rules or how to play rules. The next row shown here is an ROCA armoured brigade. As you can see, it has more tank and less mech infantry battalions than the mechanised infantry brigade. Now we show the PLA forces. We are seeing here a PLA heavy combined arms brigade. You will see this is a much larger formation with almost 50% more combat strength than the ROCA brigades. Assuming my estimation of the amphibious brigade is correct, even the amphibious brigade contains significantly more combat strength than the ROCA brigade. Although this is not really 50% anymore, it's closer to about a 20% improvement or increase over the ROCA brigade. Finally, we see what's called the medium-sized combined arms brigade, and this is yet even more powerful, and I would imagine these would be the primary armoured offensive formations for the PLA in any future war. This does not look good for the ROCA. However, the ROCA does have some significant advantages, which can be summed up in two main advantages: the SSMs and the new delivery of the M1 main battle tanks. If the PLA brigades suffer 10 to 20% casualties on the way in, their final strength will be much closer to that of the ROCA brigades. In terms of combat effectiveness, it could even be more affected as losses will be asymmetrical. So all the artillery could be lost, which would have a significant impact on that brigade's ability to attack. The next advantage the ROCA has is when the ROCA receives the M1 main battle tank, the combat capabilities of their brigades will be significantly boosted, especially in terms of launching counterattacks. The 50% advantage the PLA possesses will be reduced down to an insignificant advantage. Plus, when you factor in losses that the PLA would suffer on the way into ROC SSMs, this would almost certainly put the PLA brigades at a disadvantage once they've initially landed on the coast or on Taiwan. We do begin to see some patterns which assist us in explaining the tactics that each side are undertaking. Major focus area for the ROCA is the acquisition of F-16 fighters, which would threaten the PRC's complete dominance of the air. The F-16 could be used to launch airborne SSMs, and even the new modified iron bombs, which allowed for some guidance. While the ROC would take heavy losses, successful long-range attacks using F-16s with SSMs could cause prohibitive losses among the PRC amphibious assets. The PRC could also use SSMs to target ROC missile sites or aircraft sites or even ground sites, But this would require a surprise attack and very detailed knowledge of exactly what to hit. And while it would degrade the ROC capabilities, specifically SSM capabilities, it would not eliminate it. Air-launched SSMs also have the advantage of being able to be deployed far away from any threat areas, and then they would launch into range in order to launch their deadly load. The first week of any conflict would be a very high-tech conflict involving a significant number of high-cost missile systems, which I would imagine would be quickly expended by probably both sides. And so this concludes part 23 of my organisational video series, in this case comparing the combat strengths of the PLA and ROCA brigades. I just hope against hope that we avoid any form of military conflict, as in the long run both the people of China and Taiwan will suffer in the long run if this should occur. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.